Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, where we uncover the most chilling tales hidden in the dusty corners of history. Today we're diving into a story that will make you think twice about accepting your next dinner invitation. This is the terrifying account of what became known as history's deadliest dinner party. An evening that began with elegant conversation and ended in unspeakable horror. Before we begin, I must warn you, what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. The events of that cursed evening in 1847 would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives and leave investigators questioning everything they thought they knew about human nature. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a tale that proves sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who invite you to their table. The story begins in the autumn of 1847, in the rolling countryside of Devonshire, England. The manor house of Blackthorn Estate stood like a monument to wealth and privilege, its Gothic spires piercing the perpetually grey sky. It was here that Lord Reginald Ashworth had decided to host what he promised would be the social event of the season. An intimate gathering of 12 guests, each more distinguished than the last, brought together for an evening of fine dining and sophisticated discourse. Lord Ashworth was a man of peculiar habits and even more peculiar interests. At 62, he had spent the better part of his life traveling the world, collecting rare artifacts and studying what he called the forgotten arts of civilization. His library contained volumes that would make most scholars uncomfortable, texts dealing with subjects that polite society preferred to leave unexplored. But Ashworth was no ordinary member of the aristocracy. He was a man obsessed with pushing boundaries, with discovering truths that others feared to confront. The invitation list for that fateful evening reads like a who's who of Victorian England's intellectual elite. There was Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the renowned physician whose theories on human anatomy had revolutionized medical understanding. Lady Catherine Pemberton, the celebrated author whose Gothic novels had scandalized and captivated readers across Europe. Professor Marcus Whitmore, the archaeologist whose recent discoveries in Egypt had made headlines in every major newspaper. Each guest had been carefully selected. Each brought something unique to Ashworth's table. What none of them knew was that they had been chosen for reasons far more sinister than their social standing or intellectual achievements. Lord Ashworth had been planning this evening for months, perhaps years. Every detail had been meticulously arranged, every contingency accounted for. The menu had been crafted with surgical precision, the seating arrangements calculated to maximize what he called the evening's potential for revelation. The first guests arrived as the sun was setting behind the ancient oaks that surrounded the estate. The weather had turned uncommonly cold for October, and a thick fog had begun to roll in from the moors, wrapping the manor in an ethereal shroud that seemed to muffle all sound from the outside world. Inside, however, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. Candles flickered in crystal chandeliers, casting dancing shadows across oil paintings of long-dead ancestors who seemed to watch the proceedings with knowing eyes. Lord Ashworth greeted each guest personally, his manner charming and attentive. He was a tall, lean man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. His smile was warm, but there was something behind it, something that made more than one guest feel momentarily uncomfortable before dismissing the feeling as mere imagination. As the evening progressed, the conversation flowed as freely as the wine. Dr. Hartwell regaled the table with stories of his latest surgical innovations. Lady Pemberton discussed her upcoming novel, a tale of ancient curses and modern consequences. Professor Whitmore described his recent expedition to a newly discovered tomb, speaking of artifacts that seemed to possess an almost supernatural quality. The atmosphere was one of intellectual excitement, of minds engaged in the kind of discourse that only the most educated could fully appreciate. But as the night wore on, subtle changes began to manifest. The conversations grew more intense, more personal. Guests found themselves revealing secrets they had never spoken aloud, sharing fears and desires that they had buried deep within themselves. The wine seemed to affect them more strongly than usual, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions in ways that would have been embarrassing under normal circumstances. Lord Ashworth moved through the gathering like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, guiding conversations, asking pointed questions, drawing out responses that seemed to surprise even the speakers themselves. He had a gift for making people feel as though they were the most interesting person in the room, for creating an atmosphere of intimacy and trust that encouraged complete honesty. The dining room itself was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, with vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that depicted scenes from medieval legends. The table was set with the finest china and crystal, each piece chosen for its beauty and its significance to the evening's purpose. 13 places had been set, though only 12 guests had been invited. When asked about the extra setting, Lord Ashworth merely smiled and said that one never knew when an unexpected guest might arrive. As the first course was served, a delicate soup that seemed to warm the very soul, the conversation turned to darker subjects. Death, mortality, the nature of existence itself. These were topics that fascinated the assembled intellectuals, and they pursued them with the passion of scholars discovering new truths. What they didn't realize was that they were being guided down a very specific path, led toward revelations that would change everything they thought they knew about their host and about themselves. The servants who attended the dinner were unlike any the guests had encountered before. They moved with an almost supernatural grace, anticipating needs before they were expressed, appearing and disappearing with plates and glasses as if they were ghosts rather than flesh and blood. Their faces were pale, their eyes distant, and they never spoke a word throughout the entire evening. When one guest attempted to engage a servant in conversation, the young man simply stared blankly ahead as if he hadn't heard anything at all. By the time the third course arrived, a magnificent roast that seemed to have been prepared with ingredients unlike anything any of the guests had ever tasted. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. The initial warmth and conviviality had given way to something more intense, more primal. Conversations had become confessions, and confessions had become something approaching religious fervor. Lord Ashworth sat at the head of the table, watching his guests with the satisfaction of a man whose carefully laid plans were coming to fruition. He had spent years studying each of them, learning their weaknesses, their fears, their deepest desires. He knew exactly which buttons to push, which words to speak, which questions to ask to unlock the doors they had kept so carefully sealed. The fog outside had grown thicker, completely obscuring the world beyond the manor's walls. Inside, the candles burned lower, casting longer shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The very air seemed to thicken, becoming heavy with anticipation and something else. Something that made the guests' hearts race and their palms sweat despite the growing cold. As the evening progressed toward its climax, none of the distinguished guests could have imagined what their host had planned for them. They had come expecting elegant conversation and fine dining. What they would receive instead would test the very limits of human endurance and sanity. The deadliest dinner party in history was about to begin in earnest. And before the night was over, some of them would discover that there are invitations that should never be accepted, and hosts whose hospitality comes at a price too terrible to comprehend. As the clock struck 10, Lord Ashworth rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and commanding. The conversation died instantly, all eyes turning to their host, with an intensity that surprised even themselves. There was something magnetic about his presence, something that demanded absolute attention. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent dining room, "I trust you have enjoyed the evening thus far. The food, the wine, the stimulating discourse. But I must confess what we have experienced tonight has been merely the opening act of a much grander performance." Dr. Hartwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, a growing unease settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with the rich meal they had consumed. "Whatever do you mean, Reginald?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse. Lord Ashworth smiled, but it was not the warm, welcoming expression his guests had grown accustomed to throughout the evening. This smile was something else entirely, something that made Lady Pemberton's blood run cold and caused Professor Whitmore to grip his wine-glass with white knuckles. "I mean, my dear Edmund, that tonight we shall embark upon an experiment, a test of human nature that will reveal truths about ourselves that we never dared to acknowledge." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "You see, I have not brought you here simply for the pleasure of your company. Each of you has been selected for very specific reasons, qualities that make you essential to what we are about to undertake." The fog outside had grown so thick that it pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the candles flickered as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. The servants had vanished entirely, leaving the 13-place settings as the only witnesses to what was about to unfold. "What kind of experiment?" Lady Pemberton asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had written about horrors beyond imagination, but something in her host's demeanor suggested that fiction was about to become reality in ways she had never contemplated. Lord Ashworth moved to the fireplace, where a portrait of his ancestors hung in an ornate frame. With deliberate precision, he reached behind the painting and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering candlelight. "Throughout history," he continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a lecture, "humanity has struggled with fundamental questions about our nature. Are we civilized beings capable of transcending our base instincts? Or are we merely animals dressed in fine clothes, pretending to be something we are not? Tonight we shall discover the answer. The box clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay 12 identical vials, each containing a liquid that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The substance within moved with a consistency that was neither water nor oil, but something altogether more unsettling. "What is that?" Professor Whitmore demanded, his archaeological instincts recognizing something ancient and dangerous when he saw it. "This," Lord Ashworth said, lifting one of the vials with reverent care, "is the culmination of years of research into the furthest reaches of human consciousness. A compound derived from texts that predates civilization itself, combined with modern chemical knowledge to create something truly extraordinary." Dr. Hartwell's medical training kicked in, and he half rose from his chair. "Reginald, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, I must protest in the strongest possible terms. Whatever that substance is, it's clearly not meant for human consumption." "On the contrary, my dear friend," Lord Ashworth replied, his eyes now burning with an intensity that made several guests shrink back in their chairs. "It is meant specifically for human consumption. You see, this compound has the remarkable ability to strip away the layers of civilization, to reveal the true nature that lies beneath our carefully constructed facades." The realization of what their host was proposing began to dawn on the assembled guests. Lady Pemberton felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Professor Whitmore's hands began to tremble. Dr. Hartwell's face had gone pale as he recognized the implications of what they were being asked to participate in. "You're talking about drugging us," said Mr. Harrison Blackwood, the renowned philosopher who had remained silent throughout most of the evening. "You've brought us here under false pretenses to use us as subjects in some mad experiment." Lord Ashworth's laugh was cold and brittle. "Mad? Perhaps, but madness and genius have always been separated by the thinnest of margins. Besides, my dear Harrison, you have already been participating in the experiment. The wine you've been drinking, the food you've consumed, all of it has been carefully prepared to make you more receptive to what comes next." The guests exchanged horrified glances as the full scope of their situation became clear. They had been trapped, manipulated, prepared like lambs for slaughter. The warmth they had felt, the unusual openness of their conversations, the strange behavior of the servants, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. "The doors are locked," Lord Ashworth continued conversationally as if discussing the weather. "The windows are barred. The servants have been dismissed and we are quite alone. The fog outside is so thick that even if someone were to escape, they would become hopelessly lost on the moors before they could reach help." Mrs. Victoria Thornfield, the respected botanist, found her voice despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this to us?" "Because," Lord Ashworth replied, his voice now carrying an almost religious fervor, "I have devoted my life to understanding the true nature of humanity. I have traveled to the darkest corners of the earth, studied texts that would drive lesser minds to madness, all in pursuit of the ultimate truth. And that truth is this: Beneath our veneer of civilization, we are all monsters. He began to move around the table, placing a vial beside each guest's plate with ceremonial precision. Tonight we shall prove this hypothesis. The compound in these vials will gradually dissolve the barriers that keep your true nature in check. You will experience desires you never knew you possessed, impulses that civilized society has trained you to suppress. The Reverend Samuel Whitlock, who had remained silent throughout the evening, finally spoke. "This is blasphemy," he said, his voice shaking with outrage. "You speak of stripping away civilization as if it were some kind of curse, but civilization is what separates us from the beasts of the field." "Is it?" Lord Ashworth asked, pausing behind the Reverend's chair. "Or is it merely a mask we wear to hide our true faces? Tonight we shall remove that mask and see what lies beneath." The guests sat frozen in their chairs, each vial glowing softly in the candlelight like a small sun. The substance within seemed to pulse with life, and several of the guests swore they could hear it whispering, though no sound actually reached their ears. "You cannot force us to drink this," Dr. Hartwell declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "We are not prisoners here." "Are you not?" Lord Ashworth asked, raising an eyebrow. "I would suggest you test that theory, but I fear you will find the results disappointing. Besides, Edmund, you speak as if you have a choice in the matter. But the truth is, the choice was made for you long ago." He returned to his place at the head of the table, lifting his own vial with steady hands. "You see, my dear friends, the preliminary compounds have already been introduced to your systems. The wine, the food, even the very air you have been breathing has been carefully treated to prepare you for this moment. The vials contain merely the final catalyst. The horror of their situation settled over the guests like a shroud. They had been poisoned slowly, methodically, prepared for this moment without their knowledge or consent. The strange euphoria they had felt earlier, the unusual openness of their conversations, all of it had been chemically induced. "What will happen to us?" Lady Pemberton asked, her voice barely audible. Lord Ashworth's smile was genuinely warm now, but it was the warmth of a predator contemplating its prey. "That, my dear Catherine, is precisely what we are here to discover." The vials sat before each guest like miniature suns, their contents swirling with an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their racing hearts. The dining room, once a place of warmth and intellectual discourse, had transformed into something resembling a temple of horrors, where civilization itself was about to be sacrificed on the altar of one man's twisted curiosity. "I refuse," declared Mr. Blackwood, pushing his chair back from the table with a scraping sound that echoed through the oppressive silence. "Whatever you've done to us already, I will not willingly participate in this madness." Lord Ashworth regarded the philosopher with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "Harrison, my dear fellow, you misunderstand the nature of your situation. This is not a request. The process has already begun. Your body is already changing, already responding to the compounds coursing through your veins. The vial merely accelerates what is already inevitable." As if to prove his point, Mr. Blackwood suddenly doubled over, clutching his stomach as waves of nausea crashed over him. His vision blurred, and for a moment he saw the other guests not as the distinguished individuals he had known. but as something else entirely. Something hungry. Dr. Hartwell, drawing upon his medical training, attempted to diagnose their condition. "What exactly have you given us?" he demanded, his voice strained but still carrying the authority of his profession. "What are the symptoms we should expect?" "Symptoms?" Lord Ashworth laughed, a sound devoid of any human warmth. "My dear Edmund, you speak as if this were some common ailment. What you are experiencing is not sickness, but awakening. The compound works differently on each individual, drawing out the particular darkness that lies dormant within their soul." Mrs. Thornfield, her botanical knowledge making her acutely aware of the various plant-based toxins that could produce such effects, tried to remain analytical despite the growing terror. "The preliminary compounds you mentioned, they were designed to break down our natural resistance, weren't they? To make us more susceptible to whatever poison you've prepared for us." "Poison?" Lord Ashworth's eyes sparkled with genuine amusement. "Victoria, you wound me. I prefer to think of it as a key, one that unlocks doors that were meant to remain sealed. Throughout history, certain substances have been used to pierce the veil between the civilized mind and the primitive consciousness that lies beneath. The ancient Greeks knew of such things, as did the shamans of the Amazon and the mystics of Tibet. The Reverend Whitlock, his faith shaken but not broken, began to pray silently, his lips moving in desperate supplication. But even as he called upon divine protection, he could feel something stirring within him, something that mocked his beliefs and whispered of darker truths. "Prayer will not save you, Samuel," Lord Ashworth observed, as if reading the clergyman's thoughts. "In fact, I suspect you will find your faith to be one of the first casualties of tonight's experiment. After all, what use is salvation when damnation feels so much more honest?" Lady Pemberton, her writer's imagination conjuring scenarios more terrifying than any fiction she had ever penned, found herself studying the faces of her fellow guests with new eyes. Already she could see subtle changes beginning to manifest. Professor Whitmore's normally composed demeanor was cracking, his hands twitching as if they belonged to someone else. Dr. Hartwell's professional mask was slipping, revealing something feral beneath. "How long?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "How long before it takes full effect?" Lord Ashworth consulted an ornate pocket watch, its gold surface reflecting the candlelight like a malevolent eye. "The process varies, my dear Catherine. Some will succumb within the hour, others may resist for several hours longer. But make no mistake, resistance is futile. The compound is designed to overwhelm even the strongest will." Mr. Blackwood, still fighting waves of nausea, managed to straighten in his chair. "And what then? What happens when your precious experiment reaches its conclusion? Do you simply observe as we tear each other apart?" "Oh, Harrison," Lord Ashworth replied with genuine enthusiasm, "you underestimate the sophistication of my design. This is not some crude gladiatorial contest. The compound does not simply unleash random violence. It reveals the specific nature of each individual's hidden darkness. Some may indeed become violent, but others will discover appetites and desires they never knew they possessed." The fog outside had grown so thick that it seemed to press against the windows like a living thing, and the candles flickered as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. The very air in the room seemed to thicken, becoming heavy with anticipation and something else. Something that made the guest's skin crawl with unnamed dread. Mrs. Eleanor Fairfax, the renowned historian who had remained silent throughout most of the evening, finally spoke. "You mentioned ancient texts, forgotten knowledge. What exactly did you discover that convinced you this was necessary?" Lord Ashworth's face took on the rapturous expression of a true believer. "I discovered, my dear Eleanor, that civilization is not humanity's greatest achievement, but its greatest lie. In the ruins of temples older than recorded history, I found evidence of rituals designed to strip away the pretenses that keep us from our true nature. The ancients understood that progress is not about moving forward, but about returning to what we truly are." Dr. Hartwell felt his medical ethics warring with a growing curiosity about the compound's effects. Part of him was horrified by what their host had done, but another part, a part that seemed to be growing stronger by the moment, wanted to understand the mechanisms at work. "The servants," he said suddenly, "they were test subjects, weren't they? That's why they moved so strangely, why they seemed almost inhuman." "Perceptive as always, Edmund," Lord Ashworth nodded approvingly. "They were indeed previous subjects, though their experiments were conducted over a much longer period. What you witnessed tonight was the final stage of their transformation, when the boundary between human and something else has been permanently erased." The revelation sent a chill through the assembled guests. They had been served by individuals who had undergone the same process that was now beginning within themselves. The blank expressions, the unnatural movements, the complete absence of human warmth. All of it suddenly made terrible sense. Professor Whitmore, his archaeological instincts struggling against the growing chaos in his mind, managed to focus on a crucial detail. "The 13th place setting," he said, his voice strained. "You said you never knew when an unexpected guest might arrive, but you knew, didn't you? You knew exactly who would be joining us." Lord Ashworth's smile was answer enough. "Very good, Marcus. Yes, I knew. In fact, our final guest has been with us all evening, watching, waiting for the proper moment to make their presence known." The guests looked around the room frantically, searching for signs of another person. But the dining room appeared empty save for themselves and their host. The shadows seemed deeper now, more substantial, as if they might be hiding secrets of their own. "Where?" Lady Pemberton demanded, her voice cracking with strain. "Where is this mysterious guest?" "Patience, Catherine," Lord Ashworth replied, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "All will be revealed in due time. For now, I suggest you focus on the changes occurring within yourselves. The compound is beginning to work its magic, and fighting it will only make the process more uncomfortable." As if summoned by his words, the first real symptoms began to manifest. Mr. Blackwood's vision started to shift, colors becoming more vivid while shadows took on substance and weight. Mrs. Thornfield found herself acutely aware of every sound, every scent, every subtle movement in the room. The Reverend Whitlock felt his carefully constructed worldview beginning to crumble as thoughts and desires he had never acknowledged began to surface. "This is what you wanted," Dr. Hartwell said, his voice distant as he watched his own hands with fascination. "You wanted to see us reduced to our most primitive state. Not reduced, Edmund, Lord Ashworth corrected gently. Elevated, freed from the constraints that have kept you from experiencing the full spectrum of human existence. Tonight you will discover what it truly means to be alive. The fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, casting dancing shadows that appeared to move independently of their sources. The very walls of the dining room seemed to pulse with life, breathing in rhythm with the compound's effects on the guests' altered perceptions. Mrs. Fairfax, her historian's mind still struggling to comprehend the full scope of what was happening, asked the question that had been haunting her thoughts. The others, the previous subjects you mentioned, what became of them? Are they still alive? Lord Ashworth's expression grew thoughtful. Alive? That depends entirely on how one defines life. They exist, certainly, but in a state that transcends the limitations of ordinary human existence. They have become something new, something that exists beyond the boundaries of civilization and savagery. The implications of his words settled over the guests like a funeral shroud. They were not simply being poisoned or driven mad. They were being transformed into something else entirely, something that would no longer be recognizably human when the process was complete, as the compound continued its relentless work. The guests began to notice changes in each other that went beyond mere physical symptoms. Dr. Hartwell's professional demeanor was giving way to something more primal, his eyes taking on a predatory gleam as he studied his fellow diners. Mrs. Thornfield's botanical knowledge was becoming twisted, her mind filled with thoughts of plants that fed on human flesh rather than sunlight. The evening that had begun with such promise, with elegant conversation and sophisticated discourse, had become something unrecognizable. The distinguished guests who had gathered to discuss art, science, and philosophy were slowly being stripped of everything that made them human, reduced to their most basic impulses and desires. And Lord Ashworth watched it all with the satisfaction of a man whose life's work was finally reaching its culmination. The deadliest dinner party in history was unfolding exactly as he had planned, and before the night was over, his guests would discover that some invitations come with a price that cannot be paid in mere social currency. The transformation had begun, and there would be no going back. The fog pressed against the windows like grasping fingers, and within the dining room the atmosphere had shifted from sophisticated discourse to something far more sinister. The guests sat transfixed, watching as their fellow diners began to change before their very eyes. Professor Whitmore was the first to succumb completely. His scholarly composure cracked like an eggshell, revealing something ancient and hungry beneath. He reached across the table with trembling hands, not for food or wine, but for Mrs. Thornfield's wrist, his fingers closing around it with surprising strength. "Marcus," she whispered, but her voice carried none of the alarm it should have. Instead, there was something almost welcoming in her tone, as if she understood what he needed from her. Dr. Hartwell observed the interaction with clinical fascination, his medical training warring with impulses that grew stronger by the moment. "The compound is affecting our perception of pain and pleasure," he noted, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. "We're losing our ability to distinguish between the two." Lady Pemberton laughed, a sound that would have been beautiful under different circumstances but now carried an edge of madness. Perhaps we never had that ability to begin with, she said, her writer's mind embracing the darkness that was spreading through her thoughts. Perhaps we've simply been pretending all along. Lord Ashworth moved around the table like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of human degradation. "You're beginning to understand," he said, his voice filled with paternal pride. "The boundaries we've constructed, the rules we've imposed upon ourselves, they're all illusions. Tonight you discover what lies beneath." The Reverend Whitlock, his faith crumbling like ancient parchment, found himself drawn to the flames in the fireplace. The dancing light seemed to whisper secrets that his scripture had never revealed, truths that made his years of devotion seem like elaborate self-deception. "There is no salvation," he murmured, his voice barely recognizable. "There is only hunger, only need, only the endless pursuit of satisfaction that can never truly be achieved." Mrs. Fairfax, her historian's mind still functioning despite the chemical chaos in her system, recognized the pattern emerging among her fellow guests. "This isn't random," she said, her voice distant but certain. "You've studied each of us, haven't you? You know exactly what form our transformation will take." "Indeed," Lord Ashworth confirmed, pausing to observe Professor Whitmore's increasingly predatory behavior toward Mrs. Thornfield. "Edmund will discover that his healing hands can bring exquisite pain. Catherine will find that her imagination can conjure horrors that make her fiction seem like children's tales. Marcus will realize that his passion for ancient secrets extends to secrets hidden within human flesh." The guests no longer seemed capable of horror at these revelations. The compound had progressed too far, stripping away their capacity for moral judgment along with their civilized restraints. They accepted their host's words with the same intellectual curiosity they had once applied to academic discussions. Mr. Blackwood, his philosophical nature twisted into something unrecognizable, began to speak in a voice that seemed to come from someone else entirely. "Free will is an illusion," he said, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "We are all prisoners of our nature, slaves to impulses we pretend to control. Tonight we embrace our chains." The 13th place setting remained empty, but the guests had begun to sense a presence there, something that watched their transformation with ancient patience. The shadows around that chair seemed darker, more substantial, as if they were slowly taking form. "Who sits there?" Mrs. Thornfield asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer would be something she didn't want to hear. Lord Ashworth's smile was radiant with triumph. "Why, my dear Victoria, that seat is reserved for the guest of honor, the one who has made all of this possible, who has guided my research and whispered the secrets that led to this moment." The candles flickered in unison, and for a moment the empty chair seemed to be occupied by a figure of impossible darkness, something that existed in the spaces between light and shadow. Then the moment passed, leaving only the impression of vast, patient hunger. Dr. Hartwell found himself no longer fighting the compound's effects, but embracing them with scientific enthusiasm. "We're witnessing the birth of a new form of consciousness," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Something that transcends the limitations of human morality and social convention." The transformation was nearly complete. The distinguished guests who had arrived that evening were disappearing, replaced by something that retained their memories and knowledge but had been stripped of everything that made them recognizably human. They were becoming vessels for appetites that civilized society had spent millennia trying to suppress. Lord Ashworth raised his own vial, which he had not yet consumed, and addressed his guests one final time. My dear friends, you have served a purpose greater than yourselves. Through your sacrifice, we have proven that civilization is nothing more than a fragile mask. Beneath it, we are all monsters, all creatures of appetite and desire. He drank the contents of his vial in one smooth motion, his eyes never leaving the empty 13th chair. And now, I join you in that truth. The fog outside began to lift as dawn approached, but the horrors of that night would never truly end. The guests of Lord Ashworth's dinner party had been transformed into something new, something that would wander the earth for generations to come, spreading their particular brand of enlightenment to others who thought themselves civilized. The manor house stood empty when the authorities finally arrived, drawn by reports of strange lights and inhuman sounds. They found the dining room exactly as it had been left, 13 place settings and the lingering scent of something that might have been roses or might have been decay. The guests were never found, though over the years reports would surface of encounters with individuals who matched their descriptions. Always at night, always in isolated places, always offering invitations that seemed too tempting to refuse. This has been the Ghastly Journal, and this concludes our tale of history's deadliest dinner party. A reminder that some invitations should never be accepted, some hosts should never be trusted, and some hungers should never be fed. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who set the finest tables. Sleep well and perhaps think twice before accepting that next dinner invitation from a stranger.